Hey guys, tonight we're easing into the faint golden haze of ancient Rome, where the air is thick with flour, the ovens never cool down, and the bakers whisper to their own sacred god as they shape loaves by firelight. You walk down a narrow Roman alley, cobbled and dim, as the scent of warm bread floats up from a basement oven. A baker's apprentice wipes sweat from his brow and mutters a prayer, not to Jupiter, not to Mars, but to a little-known deity named Fornax, guardian of the oven. It's the middle of the night, and you're not sleeping yet, because apparently you decided to explore the most underappreciated corner of Roman civilization. Spoiler: you probably won't survive this life of flour, fire, and 4 a.m. wake-up calls. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge past shop stalls shuttered for the night, hearing only the creak of carts being loaded with flour sacks. Somewhere, a donkey snorts. A baker yawns. In Rome, bread is serious business, not just food, not just trade, but ritual, control, and survival. The oven room is low-ceilinged and hot. There's no natural light, only flickering fire. Clay domes glow with heat. Loaves are slipped inside with long wooden paddles, perfectly timed, because the oven's temperature changes quickly. You pause near a cracked tile where an inscription marks the spot as a pistrinum, a Roman bakery operating just below the polite society of marble baths and political debates. Here, the real Rome rises, loaf by loaf, crumb by crumb. The bakers are an exhausted bunch, but their world is rich with its own symbols. There's a terracotta plaque of a beehive, symbol of industry, and next to it, a faded painting of Fornax, goddess of the oven flame. She's barely remembered today, lost under layers of mythology, but to the ancient bakers, she was everything. A protective force against undercooked dough, burned crusts, and collapsing vaults. Quirky as it sounds, Fornax had her own official festival, the Fornicalia. No, not a cooking show. It was a religious event held in early February, and if you're thinking, that sounds like a Roman bake-off, well, sort of. Citizens would bring parched grain offerings to public ovens, overseen by their specific curia, local political religious groups. Missed your designated oven day? You'd attend the Stultorum Feriae, or Feast of Fools. Yes, it was literally the catch-up day for people who forgot their religious bread homework. Historians still argue whether Fornax was ever widely worshipped, or if she existed only as a bureaucratic side effect, a goddess invented just to explain a scheduling ritual. But for Rome's bakers, she felt real enough to pray to, especially when your entire livelihood hinged on the flames behaving. You lean against a sack of spelt, feeling the rough canvas on your arm. It's a different world here, not the empire, of emperors and legions, but of grocers, grinders, and grubby hands. The bakers, or pistores, often started their work long before sunrise, sometimes as early as midnight. You imagine the rhythm: measure, knead, shape, rest, bake, repeat. It's hypnotic, like waves on a shore, except the waves are made of wheat and sweat. Rome's diet leaned heavily on bread. Whether you were rich or poor, you consumed it daily. The types varied. The elite dined on finely milled white loaves with honey and herbs. The working class chewed on coarse brown slabs that could double as coasters. One fringe theory suggests Roman soldiers baked flatbreads on their shields over open flames. Functional cookware? Maybe. Tasty? Probably not. Sanitary? Hard no, bread wasn't just food, it was power. The empire knew that keeping bellies full kept the streets calm. That's why bakeries sprang up in nearly every district. Archaeologists have uncovered entire bakery blocks in Pompeii, complete with mills, kneading basins, and ovens still blackened with soot. In one famous bakery, loaves were found perfectly preserved under volcanic ash, still stamped with the name of the owner. Can you imagine baking something so good it survived a volcano? Ancient flex. Back in your little corner of Rome, the apprentice is using a bronze stamp to press a seal into each loaf before it enters the oven. This isn't just branding, it's accountability. If your bread made someone sick or caused a riot, the city would know who to blame. Nothing says pressure like bake this or possibly get exiled. There's also a faint hum of superstition in the air. A small figurine of a chicken hangs from the ceiling, meant to ward off bad luck. A Roman version of the lucky cat. And there's that half-joking rumor that if your dough didn't rise properly, it meant the gods were mad, or your neighbor had cast the evil eye on your yeast. Forget kitchen thermometers. These folks used omens and vibes. Oh, and fun fact, some Roman bakers wore pointed hats, kind of like the culinary version of a sorting hat. Fringe scholars suggest this might have been a mark of their trade, or just a way to keep sweat out of their eyes. Either way, you don't want to be the guy who loses his hat in the dough. As the first loaves come out of the oven, the smell is almost overwhelming. Nutty, warm, smoky with a hint of ash. You break one open. The crust crackles and steam escapes. It's not a sourdough starter Instagram fantasy. It's real, humble, and probably a bit gritty. Ancient Roman bread sometimes contained bits of stone from poorly milled flour. Your molars wince. But here's the thing. As boring as this might sound, it was the heartbeat of a city. Forget marble columns and bronze statues. Rome ran on bread. And behind every slice was a team of tired, God-fearing bakers who worked all night so others could wake to full stomachs. You exhale, letting the scent and the story linger. The fire's still burning, the loaves keep coming, and this is only the beginning. You step out of the heat of the bakery, brushing flour off your tunic, well, your imaginary tunic, and follow one of the bakers as he climbs a narrow staircase into the early Roman morning. The city is stirring. A dog barks. A market awning creaks open and someone yells about fish. You trail the baker like a sleepy ghost, watching as he stretches his back, his hands cracked from handling dough, ash, and wet cloth. You'd think baking would be a peaceful trade, a kind of meditative escape from gladiator fights and political backstabbing. But Roman baking? Absolutely not. It's hot, loud, and involves more physical labor than you signed up for in this sleepy stroll. You know how your arm gets tired whisking pancake batter? Multiply that by 12 and subtract modern appliances. Roman bakers worked grist mills, powered by donkeys or slaves, hauled sacks of flour heavier than your dignity, and stoked fires hot enough to cook a chariot wheel. And yet, for all that sweat, the job was oddly revered and feared. Bread was so essential to Roman life that its producers gained a peculiar kind of power. Bakers formed guilds, known as collegia pistorum, which offered community, resources, and protection. Not mafia-style protection, though one could, argue it wasn't far off. These guilds set prices, trained apprentices, and even organized funerals. And in Rome, having your funeral handled was kind of a big deal. It meant you mattered, that your death wouldn't go as unnoticed as, say, a chipped amphora. Here's the odd bit. Many of these bakers weren't just Roman-born citizens. A good number were former slaves. You heard that right. Slaves who baked their way to freedom and then chose to keep baking. Maybe the oven heat fried a few brain cells, or maybe they just realized that, in Rome, bread had more staying power than politics. Historians still argue whether these freedman bakers were truly respected or just tolerated. On the one hand, they played a crucial role in the food chain. On the other, elite Romans wrote about them the way modern people write about airport sushi, with thinly disguised fear and disdain. Take the poet Juvenal. He mocked bakers for their accents, their manners, and their ambitions. One of his more subtle insults compared bakers to parrots, colourful, loud, and barely house-trained. But while the elites were complaining, bakers were buying property, running shops, and occasionally marrying up. Who needs Senate approval when your sourdough makes the praetor weep with joy? Back at the bakery, another shift begins. You notice a new apprentice arrive, a teenage boy barely out of his sandals, staring in terror at the hot oven and the muscular baker beside it. The older man claps him on the back and tosses him a rag. Wipe the boards, then learn the paddle. In this world, baking isn't just about technique. It's an endurance test. Apprentices trained for years, starting with grunt work and gradually working their way up to the sacred moment of loading a loaf into the oven. That paddle, by the way, was more than a tool. It was almost ceremonial. If you botched the slide, you risked ruining the whole batch. Get it too far in, and the bread burned. Too shallow, and the dough would sag, becoming the ancient Roman version of sad cafeteria pizza. And it wasn't just about baking technique, it was about religious. Timing too. Certain days were marked for sacred baking. Fornax demanded offerings, and those offerings had to be done right. No burnt ends, no undercooked middles. You didn't want to annoy the goddess who literally watched over your oven. One charming fringe. Theory suggests that bakers tied small offerings to their ovens, bits of dough shaped like animals or coins, to curry favor with Fornax, kind of like sticking googly eyes on your fridge and calling it an art installation. No one can prove it happened, but then again, the Romans were a superstitious bunch. They believed in omens, household spirits, and gods that controlled everything, from drains to door hinges. A god for the oven? Totally on brand. There's even speculation that some bakers sang or chanted to the loaves as they baked. Part tradition, part prayer, part way to stay sane during another 12-hour shift of kneading and lifting. Picture it. A sweaty guy in a soot-streaked tunic softly humming a hymn while brushing ash off a spelt loaf. Honestly, it's kind of beautiful, kind of gross, very Roman. Your guide for this sleepy journey leans against the wall now, munching, on a crust that looks hard enough to chip enamel, but he chews contentedly, staring into the fire. This is his world, simple, harsh, and built on routine, but also strangely dignified. There's pride in making something from nothing: flour, water, salt, time, and maybe a quick prayer to a half-forgotten deity. And there's also a whisper of risk. Remember how important bread is to the Roman masses. If there's a shortage, or worse, if your bakery messes up a state-sponsored Distribution. You could become the most hated man in your district. People would riot over bread before they'd riot over a corrupt senator. Honestly, some things haven't changed. You stroll past a stack of bakery molds, one of which is shaped like a fish. No one's really sure why. Maybe it was for religious feasts, or maybe some baker just really liked fish-shaped bread. Another mold bears a smiling face, maybe a nod to Bacchus, god of parties and wine, or just a way to make kids laugh before they chomped into carbs. One mold, cracked down the middle, shows what appears to be a baker's backside. No, really. Some fringe scholars claim this was a cheeky pun, a literal bun mold. Historians still argue whether it was satire, erotic art, or just a bored apprentice playing with clay. Back to the oven now. You feel the heat again. The apprentice has graduated to shaping loaves. He's slow, cautious, and a little flour-drenched, but there's promise in his hands. One day, he'll run his own shop. Maybe have a plaque honouring Fornax. Maybe hire his own apprentices and tell them stories of gods, guilds, and old tools that only kind of worked. And you, drifting quietly, at the edge of this world, start to feel the rhythm of it all. The quiet clatter of paddles, the steady hiss of fire, the rustle of grain sacks, the occasional curse when dough gets too sticky. It's not exciting, it's not dramatic, but it's constant. And in a city fueled by chaos, that constancy mattered more than anyone admits. You follow the scent before you even realize your feet are moving. Warm crust, a hint of smoke, the faint sweetness of barley and honey. It's breakfast, if you're lucky enough to afford it. The sun lifts slowly over Rome's rooftops, casting dusty gold across brick streets and grooved stone alleys. You pass a woman selling dried dates, a man shouting about spoiled olives, and finally pause in front of a stall lined with loaves. These aren't your supermarket baguettes. Roman bread comes in styles, if you can believe it. More than a dozen, depending on region, flour, and whether the baker was feeling generous or passive-aggressive. There's panis quadratus, the round loaf scored with precise wedges, almost like a pizza had a baby with a flour. Then there's panis militaris, sturdy and dense, baked for soldiers who needed something that could double as a weapon if it didn't get eaten first. One fringe recipe, though nobody's brave enough to recreate it seriously, involves bread, baked with bits of marble dust. Why? Possibly to help with digestion. Possibly to fool buyers into thinking the loaf was heavier than it was. Historians still argue whether it was dietary innovation or just another Roman scam. You linger beside. The pista, or street bread vendor, who slaps the loaves down with the flair of someone who's been haggled with since sunrise. His customers eye the bread like it might betray them. Because here's the thing, Roman bread often did. Some bakers mixed in sawdust or chalk to stretch their flour supply. Bread was so in demand that quality control took a back seat to, is it edible, or will it at least fill the hole? One customer pulls a loaf apart, muttering something about it being too light. The vendor shrugs. You get the sense this has been his morning routine for years, maybe decades. The loaf, whatever its flaws, disappears into the man's bag, and the next in line steps up. As you wander further, a quiet thought curls into your mind. For a culture so obsessed with power, conquest, and sculpture, the Romans sure cared deeply about baked goods. In fact, bread wasn't just food, it was a political tool. And if you controlled the ovens, you controlled the crowd. Enter the Annona, Rome's grain dole system. It was the ancient version of a welfare program, but with more shouting. Free grain, sometimes processed into bread, was distributed to citizens to keep them fed and, more importantly, calm. It's hard to revolt when your hands are full of hot carbs. Politicians knew this and used it shamelessly. Want votes? Promise more grain. Want peace? Bake it. Some emperors, like Augustus, turned grain distribution into a form of art. He streamlined the system, assigned dedicated officials called curatores annonae, and monitored the imports from Egypt, Sicily, and North Africa like a hawk watching a bakery from across the street. If grain ships were late, Rome panicked. Bread prices spiked. Riots brewed. So, managing the bread supply wasn't just administration, it was crisis prevention. One famous incident involves Emperor Claudius. When grain shipments were delayed, the city erupted. People chased his officials through the streets, and Claudius had to calm the mob by promising that if the grain didn't arrive soon, he'd be first to die of hunger. Bold move, Claudius. Also deeply unconvincing. But hey, he kept the throne, so maybe the bread came in on time after all. Historians still argue whether emperors genuinely cared about feeding the people, or just feared what the people would do on an empty stomach. Probably both. A fed crowd is a sleepy crowd, and a sleepy crowd doesn't stage a coup. Even the Colosseum's free games came with snacks. Bread and circuses, panem et circenses, weren't just poetic words, they were a survival tactic. Distract the masses with blood, sports and baked goods, and they'll forget that the aqueducts leak, and the Senate is full of narcissists. Back in the neighborhood ovens, you notice an old woman muttering as she hands a copper coin to a young girl holding a cracked plate. It's their turn at the communal oven. Yes, communal. Not everyone had a kitchen, and even fewer had the luxury of an oven at home. So many Romans shaped their dough at home and brought it to the neighborhood baker to cook. Like take and bake, pizza, only more smoky and slightly more spiritual. Sometimes these ovens were run by the vicar magistri, local leaders responsible for maintaining shrines, organizing fire brigades, and making sure nobody burned down the block because they forgot to remove a wax figurine from their loaf. There are even records of firemen doubling as bakers when staff ran short, multitasking in ancient Rome. Hold the hose, flip the focaccia. One quirky but well-attested practice. Bakers would sometimes stamp their loaves with their name, logo, or a message. Archaeologists have found carbonized bread from Pompeii with stamps that say things like, made by Sila, slave of Quintus Granius. Yes, branding existed even back then. It wasn't just a loaf, it was a statement. This bread was made by Sila, and if it's burnt, that's on him. Even slaves got in on the baking action. In some wealthier households, enslaved cooks were trained to bake as part of the kitchen staff. But others, especially the lucky ones who worked in urban bakeries, gained specialized skills that could, eventually, lead to manumission. That's right. Bake enough bread, and you might earn your freedom. Not a guaranteed path, of course, but better than working in the mines. And once freed, some of those bakers rose to real prominence. Some joined or led the bakers' guilds, built tombs to honor fornax, and commissioned sculptures of themselves with oversized bread paddles, kind of like posing with your college diploma, if it could be used to lift a 40-pound rye loaf. The sound of a nearby temple bell drifts through the alley. You pass another bakery. This one smells faintly of burnt fig. Inside, two men argue over whether the morning's dough was left to rise too long. One gestures to the ceiling. "For the love of Fornax," he says. You smile, because the goddess is clearly watching them, both with that ancient, flour-dusted smirk. You keep walking. The city pulses softly around you, a living organism that survives not on law or love, or even conquest, but on the simple, stubborn rhythm of its ovens. Loaves rise, loaves fall, and every crust carries a whisper of worship, labor, and survival. Down another alley, your footsteps echo between plaster walls stained with soot and oil. The street narrows as you follow the warm, yeasty perfume that only means one thing: a bakery district. Rome had entire zones dense with pastores, the bakers, whose job, day after day, was to feed a population so large that even the gods were probably overwhelmed by the carb requests, and like any organized mess, Rome had to sort its bread makers into something more than guys with ovens. Enter the Collegia Pistorum, the Bakers' Guild. Not a cozy knitting club, not even close. These were state-sanctioned groups with hierarchy, dues, duties, and, let's be honest, a fair amount of complaining. You didn't just toss flour and hope for the best. You played by the rules or you got burned. Literally sometimes. The Bakers' Guild wasn't optional. If you were a licensed baker in Rome, especially during the Empire, you were automatically part of it. That meant responsibilities, regularly providing a quota of bread for the city, particularly for the annona, the grain dole system. No showing. Up late. No my yeast didn't rise excuses. If you slacked off, you risked fines, floggings, or in extreme cases, exile, all over a loaf. Some historians still argue whether the guild's control kept bread quality high or just turned baking into another cog in the bureaucratic meat grinder. After all, when you have quotas, quality tends to, let's say, suffer gently. But the guild also had perks, stability, status. If you were a baker who met your civic duties and paid your dues, you could earn respect, even a touch of political influence. It wasn't as glamorous as being a general or a senator, but when people rely on you not to starve, they tend to listen. Also, you got access to decent grain, not the crusty sweepings they gave to peasants pretending to be bakers. Weirdly, the Bakers' Guild had a kind of immortality clause. By the time of the late Empire, membership became hereditary. Your kids were expected to bake, and their kids, and their kids. You weren't just kneading dough, you were binding your bloodline to bread. If you tried to escape the job, Rome dragged you right back in. Think of it as the original multi-generational family business, and not always by choice. It wasn't all bad. Guild members often got tax exemptions and state protection. Some even lived in insulae, Rome's early apartment buildings, paid for by the state to ensure bakers lived near the neighborhoods they supplied. Because if there's one thing Rome feared more than Gauls, it was bread delivery delays. Now, let's talk tools of the trade. Roman bakeries weren't cozy home kitchens. They were industrial spaces, humming with labor. You walk past one and peer in. Inside, giant stone mills operated by donkeys trudging in circles, pushing massive wooden beams. The flour they ground would drift into the air, forming a soft, ghostly fog, perfect for ruining your lungs long term. Occupational hazards, Roman edition. At the back of the shop, a clay oven gapes like the mouth of a dragon, blackened from years of wood fire use. Bakers slap loaves onto the hot surface with flat paddles, their forearms dusted in flour, sweat beading across their brows. It's hot, loud, chaotic, and, somehow, calm. There's a rhythm here, a system. Dough, proof, fire, repeat. One quirky fact: Roman bakers developed a method of placing loaves into individual terracotta molds before baking. Not for decoration, but because it helped the bread cook evenly and made it easier to remove from the scorching oven floor. Plus, the mold could be stamped with a symbol, just in case someone else tried to claim credit for your baked masterpiece. Even stranger, some high-end bakers added poppy seeds, honey, or milk to their loaves. A luxury, of course, bread for senators and snobby poets. Most citizens gnawed on the standard panis plebeius, a simple wheat loaf with a crust so tough it probably required a chisel if stale, but for those with coin. You could get everything from spiced honey rolls to cakes made with dates, almonds, and even cheese. Ancient Rome. Surprisingly sweet, tooth-friendly. Still, there was a darker crust hiding under the bakery's golden glow. Slavery played a major role in keeping the ovens lit. Many of those operating mills or tending fires were enslaved individuals, often working brutal hours in sweltering conditions. Some were trained specialists, but many more were muscle, pushing, hauling, kneading until their hands gave out. And yet, a few enslaved bakers did eventually earn their freedom and went on to become prominent citizens. One of the most famous was Ulysses, a former slave turned wealthy baker, whose massive tomb still stands near Rome's Porta Maggiore. It's shaped like a giant bread box, seriously, and features a bas-relief of baking scenes. Nothing says, "I made it," like commissioning a marble mural of your best kneading form. Historians still debate whether Ulysses was trying to celebrate his trade or make fun of the elite. His tomb is loud, garish, and distinctly unsenatorial. Almost like he knew Rome would never quite see bakers as equals, so he decided to rub his flour-covered hands in their faces for eternity. And it worked. Thousands of years later, people still walk by that tomb and wonder, who was this guy with the bread obsession? You, of course, know now. He was one of many who saw dough not just as food, but as a future. The sun is higher now. The bakery workers shift, some heading out to deliver loaves, others preparing dough for the next batch. You notice a boy carrying a tray of bread stamped with symbols of fornax. A blessing, maybe, or maybe just habit. When your work depends on heat, fire, and timing, you learn to whisper a prayer now and then, even if it's just to avoid another burnt crust. You trail after the boy, drawn by the smell of bread and the odd quiet sense that this world of ovens and flour isn't just about baking. It's about power, pride, and survival. And maybe, just maybe, it's about faith too. You follow the delivery boy down a cobbled road, his tray of stamped bread bouncing gently with each step. The symbols of fornax are faint, but there, tiny impressions baked into the crust, subtle, like a signature hidden in the corner of a painting. And as you walk, the idea forms. These symbols aren't just decorative, they're talismans, rituals, a silent handshake with the divine, just in case the gods are hungry too. Bread in Rome wasn't just food, it was philosophy, economy, and religion braided into one. You arrive at a forum where vendors shout over one another and customers haggle with the ferocity of lawyers. Amid the chaos, a smaller stall stands out, not for its size, but for the attention it receives. Here, people line up not for bread, but to whisper over it, to gesture toward the skies, and to carefully tuck loaves into small cloth wraps like they're carrying something sacred, which, in a way, they are. Romans believed in the divine power of everyday things, and bread, basic, simple bread, held a special kind of spiritual weight. It was tied to more than just your next meal. It connected you to your ancestors, to your neighbors, and of course, to the capricious whims of the gods. Which brings us back to Fornax, goddess of the oven. Her role may sound niche, protector of good baking temperatures, but in a city where bad bread could spark riots, she was quietly essential. Every February, the Fornicalia festival was held in her honor. The rituals were modest. Families brought offerings of grain and baked goods to the Curiae, or neighborhood assemblies where they prayed for even heat, perfect crusts, and, if possible, no sudden fires. Real practical stuff. Not dramatic, just useful. Historians still argue whether the Fornicalia began as a true religious festival, or if it started as a civic event that later picked up divine branding. Either way, it stuck. You could miss plenty of Roman festivals and no one would care. But skip the Fornicalia, you might as well bake your bread with spite, and if you were late to the ceremony, you attended the Feast of the Fools, a kind of penalty day where you joined all the other forgetful or lazy households. It was part community joke, part social shame, and part cautionary tale. Forget Fornax, and maybe she'd forget you. Enjoy your half-burnt barley loaf. One of the festival's quirks was its decentralized nature. There wasn't one big Fornicalia, with fireworks and confetti. Each curia celebrated separately, like neighborhood potlucks with spiritual undertones. It was intimate, local, and very Roman, because while emperors loved their grand temples, everyday worship often happened in courtyards, kitchens, and market stalls. Imagine it now, the faint scent of roasted grain wafting from homes, neighbors, knocking on doors with baskets of bread still warm, and children poking loaves with curiosity, wondering if Fornax prefers crusty or soft. You chuckle to yourself. Even gods have preferences, probably. In some houses, small shrines to Fornax were built near ovens, modest things with offerings of flour, oil, or honey tucked beside soot-darkened clay. The hearth, for many Romans, was both kitchen and altar. You didn't need a priest to pray for golden crusts. You just needed a little hope, a little flour, and maybe a backup plan. And yes, while Fornax took the lead role, she wasn't alone. Bread was part of a divine support network. Vesta, goddess of the hearth, often shared credit. Some scholars even debate whether Fornax was a standalone goddess or simply an aspect of Vesta, like her more practical cousin who knew how to knead dough without drama. Either way, bakers didn't take chances. They lit a candle for both. Insurance, Roman style. Then there's the bread itself. Loaves were stamped not just with guild symbols or names, but sometimes with small religious marks, crosses, circles, stars, early forms of bread as blessing. And people genuinely believed it helped, that a symbol baked into your food could carry protective power, or at the very least, prevent indigestion. Even more peculiar, some Romans swore by lunar baking. They believed certain phases of the moon influenced how bread rose. New moon? Maybe wait a day. Waxing crescent? Excellent for fermentation. Historians still argue whether this was genuine religious belief or just another way to blame the cosmos for bad baking days. You wander past another bakery and spot a public oven. These were shared spaces where those without private kitchens could bring their dough to bake for a small fee, or sometimes just a nod of familiarity. The oven master would tuck your loaf inside, timing it by experience, not clocks. And while you waited, maybe you offered a whisper to Fornax, or you just stared into the flames, letting the heat lull your thoughts somewhere softer. Rome wasn't a place where everyone could afford extravagance, but bread? Bread was the anchor. It was democratic in a way Rome itself rarely was. Rich or poor, senator or servant, you needed your loaf. And when things got rough, like during grain shortages or import delays, people didn't write letters to senators. They protested outside bakeries. Even Emperor Augustus knew this. He famously expanded the grain dole and kept close watch on the city's grain supply, not because he loved carbs, but because he understood the psychology of the crust. Keep the bread coming, and the people stay calm. Cut off the loaves, and even the gods couldn't help you. And so, Fornax wasn't just a quaint little deity tucked in the corner of Roman religion. She represented something deeper, the belief that everyday survival deserved divine attention, that even something as ordinary as baking had a place in the heavens. And maybe, just maybe, she reminded people that fire, so useful, so necessary, was always one bad day away from turning destructive. The delivery boy stops at a shop front and hands over his tray. The vendor nods, inspects the loaves, and slips a few coins into the boy's hand. He runs off again, probably to pick up another round. The world turns, and the ovens stay warm. You linger in the quiet that follows, the heat from a nearby oven brushing your cheek. Somewhere in the distance, someone laughs. Somewhere closer, someone prays. And you think, there's something beautiful about worshipping through work, about folding faith into flour and trusting that the next loaf will rise just right. You lean against a wall near the bakery, watching the soot-streaked baker wipe his brow with the same towel he uses to grasp the paddle. His face is flushed from standing too close to the fire all morning. His clothes smell like flour and smoke. His hands, dusted in ash, move with mechanical grace, scooping, sliding, checking, tapping. You get the feeling he doesn't think while he works. He just flows, like the oven speaks to him in heat and time. Now here's where things get weird, in the best way, because Romans didn't just bake for the living. Oh no, they baked for the dead too. Yep. Bread was part of the afterlife starter pack. You follow an older woman down a side street toward a necropolis. She carries a covered basket. It doesn't jingle with coins or clink with glass. It's soft, warm, smells sweet. Inside are small, honeyed loaves, round, golden, carefully wrapped in linen. She places them beside a weathered tombstone, whispers something under her breath, and walks away without looking back. These were called liba, ritual cakes offered to the spirits of deceased relatives. Because what better way to show love than carbs from beyond the grave? In Roman culture, the line between the living and the dead wasn't a hard stop. It was more like a fuzzy boundary you could occasionally visit, with gifts. During Parentalia, a 9-day festival in February, families honoured their ancestors with flowers, wine and bread. Cemeteries became crowded with picnicking mourners who chatted with ghosts like they were catching up over brunch. You picture a Roman family seated at a grave, kids fighting over slices of libum while mum pours watered wine onto the soil and dad mutters to great-uncle Gaius about how much grain prices have risen. It's oddly comforting, Like your weird relatives don't stop being weird, even in the afterlife. And while most cultures do ancestor worship, Romans really doubled down. They believed in manes, the benevolent spirits of the dead, and lemures, the vengeful ones. Want to guess which kind showed up if you forgot their bread offering? Yeah, not the chill ones. So you fed them, not just to honor them, but to keep them happy. Imagine your grandma haunting your dreams not because of your life choices, but because you forgot her favorite loaf. Spooky, but also very on brand. Historians still argue whether these rituals were inherited from Etruscan practices or developed uniquely in Roman households. The overlap is fuzzy. The traditions are older than most surviving texts. But what's clear is that bread bridged more than hunger. It linked generations, softened grief, and turned mourning into something communal. And, of course, these offerings weren't just tossed on graves willy-nilly. There were rules, ritual purity, proper timing, appropriate ingredients. You couldn't just hand over a stale crust and expect grandma to bless your crops. Some households even had tiny household shrines, lararia, where miniature loaves were placed for household gods and ancestors alike. It was part pantry, part portal. You pass a home now, and inside you glimpse one of these shrines, a little alcove by the kitchen with smoky figurines and a few crumb-strewn plates. There's a loaf there, still steaming, probably blessed earlier, that morning. You can practically hear the unspoken agreement. I feed you, you protect my plumbing. And the dead weren't the only ones with a carb addiction. Soldiers, too, were deeply tied to bread. You follow a detachment of Roman legionaries through the city gates. Their packs are heavy, but the one item they always carry, a disc-shaped loaf, durable as a helmet and about as tasty. Military bread, often called bucculatum, was tough, dry, and meant to last for days, even weeks. It was more survival gear than snack. You'd soak it in wine or broth to make it edible again. Think croutons in self-defense mode. Roman soldiers were trained not just to fight, but to bake. Portable ovens marched with them, and some legions even had designated bakers, because an army really does march on its stomach, even if the bread tastes like ancient drywall. Here's the kicker. Some archaeologists believe bucculatum was a key reason Rome could expand so far. It freed troops from relying on local food supplies, which meant longer campaigns, fewer riots, and less pillaging for lunch. It was logistical genius disguised as baked mediocrity. And get this, at some camps, soldiers molded their loaves into shapes, helmets, shields, even miniature temples before eating them. Historians still argue whether this was meant to bring luck, mark units, or just pass the time between battles. Maybe it was all three, or maybe it was just one really bored centurion who got carried away with dough. The bread wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable. It was part of the rhythm of camp life. Rise, drill, march, bake. There's something soothing in that. The consistency of crust when everything else is chaos. And even beyond soldiers, bread had this rhythm-like power in daily Roman life. Bakers started before dawn. Vendors sang out loaves like musical notes, and public ovens pulsed like steady drums in every neighborhood. There was a heartbeat to it, a pulse you didn't notice until it stopped. You walk past a baker's guild hall, its doors carved with ears of wheat and fire symbols. Inside, men gather to argue over flour weights, set prices, and trade gossip. The guild wasn't just a trade union. It was a fraternity, a political club, a religious group, and an economic engine all in one. Join the guild, and you had protection, prestige, and, if you were lucky, a shot at being appointed curator panis, the official overseer of bread. That was a big deal. Imagine being the one guy responsible for making sure Rome didn't run out of loaves. Stressful? Yes, but powerful. Bread wasn't just nourishment, it was leverage, empire-fueling leverage, and in the middle of it all was the act itself. Baking, flour on your hands, heat on your face, dough that rises if you treat it right. It's both art and math. Simple, but not easy. The woman at the tomb returns, her basket empty now. She walks slower than before, maybe lighter, maybe lonelier. You wonder if her offering reached whoever it was meant for, and in that quiet moment, you realize bread isn't just about hunger. It's about memory, about presence, about faith, not just in gods or ancestors, but in the idea that something warm, golden and soft can hold meaning far beyond its ingredients. The air shifts a little as you walk deeper into the maze of Roman streets, slipping past ivy-covered walls and the clatter of amphorae being unloaded in a corner market. There's a different energy here, slower, a bit wealthier, a touch more performative. You've stumbled into the domus of a wealthy merchant, and it smells suspiciously like toasted almonds and smug satisfaction. In the private kitchens of Rome's elite, bread becomes something more than just fuel. Here, it's a status symbol, an edible flex. You watch a kitchen slave, trained like a pastry chef, gently sculpt a crescent-shaped loaf filled with dates, cheese, and pine nuts. He doesn't just knead the dough, he caresses it like it owes him rent. This, you're told, is arta leganus, a luxury bread often confused with early Roman cake. It's sweet, it's layered, it's outrageously unnecessary. But that's the point. In these homes, bread is no longer survival, it's performance. Romans were nothing if not dramatic about dinner, and bread, humble as it was, could get swept up in that theatre. Hosts competed to outdo one another with exotic ingredients, saffron from the east, Syrian figs, even snow-chilled butter from the Alps. They dyed loaves with squid ink, shaped them into animals, or braided them into elaborate wreaths to decorate their banquet tables before guests even took a bite, and you better believe guests noticed. Imagine walking into a dinner party and being greeted not with hors d'oeuvres, but with an edible sculpture of a horse-drawn chariot made of crust. Yeah, it's hard to feel casual while nibbling a masterpiece. Historians still argue whether these breads were served as actual food or treated more like table decor, sort of like those fake fruit bowls in your grandma's living room. But fragments of carbonized breads found in Pompeii's richer homes show clear signs of artistic shaping and very little actual slicing. Speaking of Pompeii, let's talk about one of the best preserved pieces of culinary history, a loaf of bread split into 8 sections, perfectly fossilized by Mount Vesuvius. You can still see the baker's stamp on it. Imagine being so proud of your baking that you branded it like a cow. This scorched hunk of bread. Oh yeah, that's from Lucius's shop. He always did have the fluffiest crumb. Back in our merchant's villa, the slaves set the table with bread as both food and metaphor. A thick, dense loaf symbolizes wealth because it takes more grain. A delicately leavened one speaks to advanced technique. And that twist of golden libum on the altar, that's not just dessert. It's a thank you to the gods for the abundance, or at least an attempt to keep them in a good mood. Here's a quirky fact. Some Roman noblewomen had specific servants just for baking, not cooking, not cleaning, just for bread. And not just any bread, fancy bread. Flavored, perfumed, sculpted bread. You think your sourdough starter has a personality. These women had entire staffs to coax, twist, and bless their dough into shape. And yes, there were gender dynamics in all this. In lower-class homes, baking was often the woman's job, done in cramped kitchens with simple tools. But in the upper crust, pun fully intended, bread making became a craft worthy of delegation and celebration. Status did weird things to flour. You peek into a nearby alley, where a lower-class woman is slapping dough on a stone, her toddler screaming in the background and a chicken running between her feet. It's chaos. But that bread, it's going to taste just as good, maybe better, because for the poor, bread wasn't a symbol. It was dinner. You ate what you could afford. Mostly coarse wheat or barley loaves, sometimes with bits of dried bean, or lentil mixed in for bulk, sometimes day-old scraps soaked in broth to stretch the meal. It was less about flavour, more about fullness. And while the elite dined on golden rolls the size of their egos, the average Roman's bread was often dark, dense, and sour. But it kept them going. It was honest food, quietly heroic in its consistency. There's a strange democracy to bread in Rome. Rich or poor, soldier or senator, you ate it, you relied on it. You might fight over its price or whisper prayers over it or stuff it in a tomb, but it was always there. That ubiquity gave bread a certain holiness, and not just metaphorically. Some Roman philosophers waxed poetic about bread as the perfect food. Stoics praised its simplicity. Epicureans praised its balance. Even the satirists couldn't leave it alone, mocking aristocrats who spent more time sculpting their loaves than understanding their slaves. In one corner of the city, you stumble on a gathering of scribes and scholars, debating bread like it's political theory. One argues that the rise of leavened bread signals moral decay. Another counters that only the civilized man eats fermented grain. You wisely say nothing and quietly munch your crust. It's comforting to know that even in ancient times, people could start a philosophical war over gluten. Meanwhile, religious rituals continued to spin their own flavor into the doughy world of Roman baking. Temples offered special loaves to specific gods. Juno received honey cakes shaped like moons. Ceres, goddess of grain, got flatbreads and wheat wreaths. And in mystery cults, like those worshipping Isis or Mithras, initiates sometimes received sacred bread as part of their initiation. Historians still debate whether these breads were literal sacraments or symbolic gestures, but the pattern is clear. Bread didn't just nourish the body, it became a stand-in for spiritual transformation. Even funerals, remember, had loaves, but so did weddings, births, business openings, and even apologies. Need to patch things up with a neighbour, bring bread, trying to impress a senator, show up with a basket of saffron rolls. It was the Swiss Army knife of goodwill. Back at the merchant's banquet, the guests are finally nibbling at the bread swans. You notice one of them discreetly pocketing a roll for later. Even in luxury, the instinct to hoard bread survives. Some things don't change. As night falls, you wander past homes glowing with lamplight. You catch snatches of conversation. Bread as gossip, bread as prayer, bread as memory. It's everywhere. And the more you notice it, the more you realize it's not boring at all. Bread is the wallpaper of Roman life. Subtle, unshowy, essential. It listens, it absorbs, it survives. And in its crusty silence, it tells a story louder than any speech. You turn a corner just as the early dawn blushes over the tiled rooftops, and you catch a rare moment. A baker, half asleep, stretching his back as he leans against a warm oven, the smell of flour still clinging to his tunic. Around him, baskets of fresh loaves are being loaded onto carts. But these aren't going to homes or temples. They're headed for the Annona, the vast grain dole that fed the city's belly. The Roman grain dole is like an ancient government stimulus plan, but with carbs. As Rome's population ballooned, the state faced a problem. Too many mouths, not enough bread. So, they did what any empire would do. They nationalized hunger. Every month, eligible citizens received a portion of wheat or grain, sometimes processed into bread, sometimes raw. This was the Cura Annani, and it was a logistical monster, moving literal tons of grain across seas, over roads, into the mouths of 1 million people. Yeah, you probably wouldn't survive running that operation. The man behind this miracle of food logistics, often a special official known as the Praefectus Annani, his job, make sure no one starves and, equally important, make sure no one riots. Because here's the spicy truth. When Romans got hangry, they didn't just complain, they burned things. Food scarcity sparked revolts, toppled careers, and made emperors sweat. No bread, no peace, and the emperors knew it. That's why many emperors, from Augustus to Aurelian, tied their reputations to feeding the city. Historians still argue whether the dole was genuinely altruistic or just clever political insurance. Probably both. The Roman masses, or plebs, could be soothed with cheap bread and raucous entertainment. Hence the phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses. A cynical summary of how Rome pacified its people with food and fun. If you're full and distracted by gladiators, you're less likely to overthrow the Senate. So what did this bread look like? Well, for many, it was simple and functional. Round loaves, often pre-scored for easy tearing, made of wheat or barley, depending on the year's harvest. Sometimes a bit gritty, thanks to the rudimentary milling methods. You might catch a crunch that wasn't from a crust, but from leftover stone particles in the flour. Bon appetit. And here's a quirky tidbit. Archaeologists in Egypt found ancient loaves from Roman times with bite marks still in them, which means someone either died mid-snack, or the bread was so dense it outlived the biter. But back to Rome. The grain itself came from across the empire. Sicily, Sardinia, Egypt. Especially Egypt. That Nile-grown wheat was Rome's favorite. Reliable, plump, and shippable. Ships loaded with grain followed carefully guarded sea routes to ensure the capital's food supply didn't get wet or pirated. Once in Rome, it was stored in massive granaries, cool, dark structures designed to preserve grain in bulk. Some, like the Horia Galbae, could hold thousands of tons. Picture cavernous stone rooms stacked with sacks of wheat, guarded like treasure, because to Rome, it was. Now, not just anyone could stroll in and grab a bag. The dole was for citizens only. You had to prove your status, often by registering your name and family with city officials. There were even clay tokens, tesserae frumentarii, handed out to eligible folks, like a punch card, but for survival. You line up in your imagination, squinting against the Roman sun as you wait your turn at a distribution center. Kids dart between legs, hoping for crumbs. Vendors sell onions and fish nearby, banking on the fresh bread crowd. And there, behind a stone counter, someone shovels grain into sacks with the bored authority of a DMV clerk. It's mechanical, repetitive, but sacred in its own way. a ritual of survival that repeated month after month. And woe to the politician who let it falter. In fact, emperors used the dole as a branding tool. Julius Caesar famously expanded it. Augustus refined it. Trajan improved the infrastructure. Aurelian took it further, offering actual loaves instead of just grain. Imagine getting an upgrade from make your own to just heat and eat, ancient Rome's version of pre-sliced bread. But of course, no good system goes unabused. There were scandals, citizens faking their eligibility, officials skimming off the top, bakers diluting flour with chalk to make more dough from less grain. Yes, chalk, because nothing says delicious like a little calcium carbonate surprise. Still, the annona worked, most of the time. It kept unrest down and bellies full. For some citizens, the monthly grain dole was their only consistent food source, especially the elderly, the sick, or those too poor to afford regular meals. Bread became not just sustenance, but identity. Historians still debate how many people relied fully on the annona. Estimates range from 150,000 to 300,000. But what's clear is that the system created a unique kind of citizen, one whose survival was directly tied to the state. And in a way, that made bread the ultimate political currency. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate that. A society so advanced in infrastructure and so fragile in hunger that one bad harvest or blocked shipment could spark chaos. The entire empire depended on grain routes as vital arteries, and the heartbeat? Rome's ovens. Now, imagine the soundscape of a Roman bakery working for the annona. Roaring fires, barked orders, the clatter of wooden paddles, the rhythmic slap of dough on stone. Not cozy, industrial, brutal, but effective. These bakers weren't crafting dainty rolls for noble banquets. They were feeding an empire on a deadline. You feel the weight of it. Flour dust on every surface, heat pressing against your cheeks, the smell of yeast and labor. It's not pretty, but it's beautiful in its own tired way. As you step out into the morning sun, clutching your imaginary ration, you realize something simple but profound. Every bite of bread is a minor miracle, grown in another land, shipped over dangerous waters, milled and baked by unseen hands, and given to you. Because somewhere, someone decided your life was worth the effort, and tomorrow, it'll happen again. You wander past the edge of the Subura district, where the smell of fresh bread gives way to something much stronger. Smoke, sweat, and politics. Here, behind the crisp crust of Roman loaves, another kind of heat simmered. Regulation. Bakers weren't just flour-covered artisans rolling dough at dawn. They were part of a rigid system, a culinary cogwheel embedded in the Roman economy, and one that the emperors kept a very close eye on. See, by the 3rd century CE, baking in Rome wasn't exactly a freelance gig anymore. It had become a state-controlled profession. You didn't just decide to open a bakery like it was some rustic hipster sourdough venture. You inherited it, literally, by law. This is where we meet the Collegia Pistorum, the bakers' guilds. These weren't cozy little clubs where you traded sourdough starters and complained about crust consistency. No, these were official, semi-mandatory organizations of bakers, regulated and monitored by the government. Once you or your father joined, you were in for life. And so were your kids. It was hereditary, like noble titles. But instead of crowns, you got flour sacks. Historians still argue whether these guilds offered protection or punishment. On one hand, they gave bakers access to grain supplies, state contracts, and a guaranteed market. On the other hand, they couldn't raise prices freely, change professions, or even pass on the family business to someone outside the guild. You were, in essence, a flowery civil servant. And it gets weirder. Under the later Roman Empire, bakers couldn't even leave Rome, like at all. They were legally bound to stay in the city, because someone had to keep the ovens hot and the bread rolling. You might imagine it like a reverse celebrity chef situation. You're too valuable to ever go on tour. It sounds absurd, right? But the logic was brutal and effective. If Rome's bakers disappeared, so did Rome's bread. And without bread, you already know, riots, revolts, and a very angry crowd chanting something like, "No panem, no peace." Now picture this. It's the middle of the night, and a baker is caught sneaking out of the city, hoping to escape to a quieter life in the countryside. Maybe raise sheep, maybe never touch yeast again. But he's stopped by a city official, hauled back, and, punishment depending, fined or conscripted. Because you don't just quit being a baker in Rome. The state won't let you. It might surprise you that baking, of all things, was one of the professions included in what were called corporation as necessary corporations. That sounds awfully modern, right? But Rome was already managing essential services like a sleepy-eyed HR department. Bakers, butchers, even funeral workers. These were vital services, and they had no option to bow out. It was civic duty, in apron form. Even the way bakers got their grain was tightly controlled. The Prefectus Annonae, that grain czar we mentioned, had the power to assign flour quotas to each bakery. You didn't shop around for wheat, you got your allotment, and you'd better make it last. But let's slip into a real shop now. Imagine, you walk into a modest bakery, probably tucked behind a home, because most Roman bakers lived where they worked. You can almost hear the thudding rhythm of kneading, the hiss of hot iron pans, the low murmur of a family working in practiced silence. Teenage boy flips loaves, a girl brushes off flour-covered amphorae, and the father, a man with forearms like marble statues, pulls flat, scored bread from the oven. That bread, government assigned. The recipe, standardized. Your creativity, not encouraged. You're not here to innovate. You're here to not get arrested. Quirky fact? There's evidence that bakers were occasionally punished with something called the post-bake parade. If their bread was short-weighted, meaning lighter than regulation, they might be forced to walk through the city streets wearing a sign or a loaf around their neck. It's the ancient equivalent of a public Yelp review. Only everyone's watching and your loaf is literally dragging your reputation down. And yet, despite all the regulation, many bakers still found clever little ways to work around the system. Some secretly baked higher quality loaves for private clients. Wealthy families who wanted something extra soft, extra white, extra pricey. Others bribed grain officials for a few extra sacks. And some, bold and tired, just tried to run. The fee, Emperor Aurelian, once tried to fix these growing problems by increasing the number of government bakeries and formalizing more guild rules. He even forced the Senate to recognize baking as a noble calling. Not that many senators took up sourdough. Still, it was a state-level pat on the back. One scholarly theory says that over-regulation eventually crushed the spirit of Roman bakers, that it made innovation impossible and created generations of unwilling workers. But another view, it made them essential, embedded into the empire's lifeblood. Yes, they were controlled, but they were also protected. You couldn't be fired. You couldn't be forgotten. Imagine that strange comfort. You know your son will be a baker, and his son, and his, for centuries. Your family name will be tied to flour and fire. Maybe you hate it. Maybe you're proud. Maybe you just get on with it. You think about how today we talk about food as art, as expression. But back then, food was survival. Bread was infrastructure, and baking was a civic service bound in legal chains. And yet, somewhere in that floury routine, there had to be joy. A perfect loaf pulled from a glowing oven, the sigh of relief when your quota is met, the warm nod of a satisfied neighbour, even a state-bound baker, trapped by policy and paperwork, could find a moment of peace in that golden crust. And that's Rome for you, a place where even bakers couldn't leave town without a permission slip, but still somehow made history. One loaf at a time, you stay near that dim bakery doorway, but now the air carries a different kind of heat. Not from the ovens, but from the simmering drama of supply chains. Yes, even in ancient Rome. Because behind every steaming loaf, there's a tangled web of transportation, taxes, contracts, and grain shortages just waiting to ruin a baker's week. And tonight, you're going to feel every bumpy cart ride of it. So how exactly did a simple hunk of bread get from a field in Egypt to your mouth in a Roman alley? The answer, of course, is, with ridiculous difficulty. Rome didn't grow nearly enough grain to feed itself. Never had, never tried. The city was far too busy being the cultural, economic, and bureaucratic black hole of the empire. So instead, the Romans leaned heavily on their provinces, particularly Egypt and North Africa, to ship in massive quantities of grain each year. We're talking hundreds of thousands of tons. Historians still argue whether these provinces produced more grain than they exported, or if Roman demand created localized famines. But that's a spiral for another night. The fact remains, Rome was like a teenager with a bottomless stomach, completely dependent on others for food. Picture this: enormous grain ships, sometimes over 100 feet long, ploughing through the Mediterranean, their sails swollen like oversized pillowcases. They're heavy, creaky, and honestly a little scary. Some didn't even have keels. The sailors must have spent their lives praying to Neptune, and possibly Feronia, just in case they needed to be reborn from a shipwreck. The grain first arrived at the port of Ostia, Rome's maritime mouth. From there, it was transferred onto smaller riverboats and floated up the Tiber into the city itself. And here's your quirky tidbit. These riverboats were often pulled by hand. Yep. Workers, sometimes slaves, would trudge along the riverbanks, dragging these grain-filled barges upstream with thick ropes. It was like Uber Eats, but horrifying. Now, once the grain finally arrived at one of the massive granaries in the city, called Horea, the real fun began. These were not charming barns with hay bales. These were stone and brick fortresses, some big enough to house modern airplanes, with ventilation systems to keep the grain from going musty. And Roman officials, bless them, kept very detailed logs about how much grain came in, how much went out, and who got how much. This was the lifeblood of the city. And of course, it was constantly at risk of being disrupted. Pirates, storms, incompetent governors, the occasional plague of rats. Every year was a potential grain crisis. In fact, some emperors, like Augustus, spent more time managing grain logistics than they did organizing wars. And who bore the brunt of all this? That's right, your local baker. If the grain shipment was late or smaller than expected, bakers still had quotas to meet. No grain? Too bad. You still had to bake your assigned loaves for the free distribution, which meant cutting corners, diluting, flour, and, yes, occasionally adding things that definitely don't belong in bread. You remember that bit about ashes and chalk? Desperation turns creativity into culinary horror shows. One popular urban legend says that a baker once got so desperate during a grain shortage that he ground up stale bread, swept flour off the floor, and mixed in sawdust to meet his quota. Did it work? Probably not. Did he get punished? Probably yes. Did people still eat it? If they were hungry enough, absolutely. Of course, sometimes the bakers got lucky. Occasionally, an emperor would declare a temporary relief, forgiving part of the quota if grain shipments were proven delayed, but those were rare. The pressure was constant. Bread wasn't just food, it was politics, and you were expected to deliver, whether the grain did or not. There's even evidence of legal contracts drawn up between the city and large baking households, laying out how much bread had to be baked when it had to be delivered, and what penalties applied for failure. You couldn't ghost the empire. You couldn't call in sick. You could maybe lose a finger to the oven and still be expected to get that dough rising. And here's a modern feeling twist. Some elite bakers subcontracted. That's right. They got grain from the government, then hired less established bakers to do the dirty work. A little exploitative? Maybe. A little genius? Also maybe. The Roman version of drop shipping, only with crusty buns. These grain shortages didn't just cause local trouble. They could spark riots, real ones. Angry mobs of citizens storming into the streets, throwing amphorae and demanding answers. Some emperors had to literally stand on balconies and toss out bread to calm people down. Panem et circenses, remember. If the panem goes, the circenses aren't nearly enough. One particularly unfortunate official, the Praefectus Annoni, once had to explain an entire grain delay by blaming bad winds at sea. Sorry, Rome. The grain's stuck in a harbour in Alexandria because the breeze was lazy this week. That poor man probably slept with one eye open. By the 3rd century, some emperors tried to stabilize the chaos by building more permanent infrastructure, grain fleets, grain roads, grain inspectors. Diocletian even tried to freeze prices with his famous edict on maximum prices, listing how much a loaf of bread should cost, as if price controls ever go smoothly. Historians are still debating whether Rome's heavy reliance on imported grain was ultimately its downfall. Some say it made the empire too fragile, one bad season in Egypt, and you had mass unrest in the capital. Others say it was actually a triumph of logistics, proof that Rome could coordinate a continent-wide food delivery system centuries before the idea of a shipping invoice even existed. But you're still here, walking the cobbled streets with a warm loaf in your arms, freshly baked from Egyptian wheat, shaped by Roman hands, and kissed by 1,000 bureaucratic headaches. It smells like stability, like survival, like one small thing in an empire that somehow, miraculously, kept working most of the time. And as you bite into that crust, slightly burnt but still soft inside, you think about how many hands brought this bread to life, from farmer to sailor, to tax collector, to baker, and finally, to you. You're chewing slowly now, strolling through the soft dark just outside the bakery, and your thoughts drift to the strange rules of the Roman bread world. Because it wasn't just flour, fire, and stress. No, this city, so obsessed with order, baked bureaucracy right into the dough, and you, the humble baker, had better keep your paperwork as tidy as your crust. Let's start with what you could and couldn't make. See, not every loaf was legal. There were actual regulations on what types of bread could be sold, where, and for how much. Imagine that. A world where the government tells you your sourdough is too ambitious. The Roman authorities didn't trust bakers to be entirely honest with ingredients. Maybe it was the chalk incident. Maybe it was the time someone tried to pass off barley loaves as proper wheat ones. Whatever the reason, Rome stepped in with rules, and lots of them. For instance, there was the panis plebeius, or bread of the commoners, often given out for free as part of the grain dole. This wasn't artisanal. It wasn't sprinkled with sea salt and olives. It was functional, filling, and government approved. You had to bake it to a set weight. Anything lighter? That's fraud. Anything heavier? That's a charity donation you didn't intend. Now, if you were a private baker making fancy loaves for paying customers, you had a bit more leeway. But even then, you had to follow guild rules. Yes, Roman bakers had guilds, or collegia. And those collegia came with expectations. You couldn't just open a hipster bakery in the Suburra and start selling lavender ciabatta without somebody raising a very bureaucratic eyebrow. One mainstream historical fact: membership in a collegium wasn't always voluntary. Starting around the late Empire, it became hereditary. That's right. If your father was a baker, congratulations, so are you. Forever. Historians still argue whether this policy was a desperate economic strategy or just another way to keep Rome's massive bread machine running smoothly. Either way, it made sure someone was always stuck kneading dough. The guild system also came with perks: access to bulk grain, legal protection, shared ovens, and sometimes even religious holidays dedicated to your trade. But it also meant more: regulation. If a baker in your guild sold moldy bread, guess who had to deal with the fallout? Everyone. It was like the world's most stressful bake-off. And here's a quirky tidbit. If a baker really messed up, say, shortchanging customers, mixing in non-edibles, or skipping quotas, he could be publicly punished by being paraded around the city wearing a loaf of bread around his neck. Just imagine the shame, flaky disgrace literally dangling from your shoulders. Now, some try to avoid the grind by cheating the system, maybe buying grain on the black market, maybe bribing officials to underreport their deliveries. But Rome was full of eyes and ears and scrolls and taxes. You had to keep meticulous records of how much grain you received, how much bread you baked, and to whom it was distributed. Sloppy math could mean serious trouble. And then there was the issue of bread weight. You didn't just eyeball your loaves and hope for the best. Roman officials had standardized weights, and they checked them. Sometimes randomly, sometimes aggressively. A little too much water in your dough to bulk it up. That's fraud. A little too little bread per dole. That's grounds for fine, flogging, or, for repeat offenders, exile. Yes, exile. Over bread. You really couldn't afford to burn the crusts or the rules. What's stranger still, baking was considered both a public service and a suspicious activity. The city needed you desperately, but it didn't trust you at all. That's why records suggest that some bakeries were surveilled by minor magistrates, not because anyone expected espionage, though wouldn't that be a twist, but because flour fraud could spark unrest. And let's not forget the imperial bakery system. Yep, Some emperors set up state-run bakeries to supply the army or the palace directly. These bakeries didn't play around. Their workers were often slaves or freedmen locked into lifetime service. Some wore uniforms. Others were marked with tattoos showing they belonged to the state. The dream of opening a cozy bakery near the Forum probably died quickly when you realized you were kneading bread under military supervision. But if you stayed in the private sector and played your cards right, you could rise in status. Some bakers became minor celebrities, especially those who supplied the biggest villas or temples. One inscription found near Pompeii praises a baker for his unmatched loaves and civic virtue. Imagine Yelp reviews carved in stone. Still, even for the successful, the shadow of regulation never left. You'd be inspected, audited, shouted at by customers, priests, and possibly stray goats. If a festival ran short on bread, everyone turned to the bakers. If a feast went stale, it was your fault. You were both vital and expendable. A dough-flinging paradox. And yet, you carried on. Every day, you rolled out of bed before the sun, walked through flour-dusted alleys, and got to work. The heat, the math, the grind, it was all just part of the rhythm. You didn't do it for love. You did it because Rome needed bread. And maybe deep down, you knew that each crusty roll helped hold an empire together. You pass a public posting board now and squint at a recent edict. Price adjustments for bread following last week's grain shipment delays. The wax tablet below, it reads, "Complaints will not be heard after midday." Classic. As you move on, the city hums softly around you. The bakery's ovens are cooling. The night shift is finishing cleanup. And someone, somewhere, is writing another law about flour. The alley smells like ash and rosemary now. You stretch your arms, feeling the soreness in your shoulders, and keep walking. Because tonight, we're heading into the weirdest corner of your world. Superstitions. Yes, baking in ancient Rome wasn't just about technique and timing. It was also deeply tangled in ritual, omens, and good old-fashioned paranoia. You'd think turning wheat into bread was a matter of flour, water, heat, and sweat. But not in Rome. Here, you're dealing with gods, spirits, dreams, charms, curses, and the occasional haunted mixing bowl. Probably. Let's start with the flour. The moment you open a new sack, you whisper a blessing, just a little one. Because if you don't, the spirit of the grain might take offense. This isn't just about honoring the goddess Annona, who oversaw the grain supply. No, it's older and stranger. The grain remembers being alive. You're taming it, transforming it. So you show respect. Or else. And it's not just you. All, over Rome, bakers talk to their dough. Not because they're lonely, though some of them definitely are, but because they believe it helps the loaf rise more evenly. Soft words, soft crumb, a little joke here or there. Fluffier center. Is that science? Definitely not. But it's tradition. And it's weirdly comforting to mutter to your bread like it's a baby pig wrapped in a linen sling. One mainstream historical fact. Romans believed certain foods were spiritually hot or cold. Not in temperature, but temperament. Bread was considered a harmonizing food, meant to balance the body. This meant baking wasn't just economic or culinary, it was practically medicinal. And of course, it had to be made in alignment with the stars. So yes, some bakers in Rome used astrology. Full moons for airy bread, new moons for denser loaves. Mars rising? Bake something spicy, like garlic bread. Saturn in retrograde? Cancel everything and just make flatbreads. Historians still argue whether these astrological baking practices were widespread or just isolated among more eccentric bakery owners, especially those outside the city. But records from Herculaneum and other towns suggest enough overlap that it wasn't entirely fringe. Speaking of fringe, the oven itself was sacred. Before the first fire of the day, many bakers would make a small offering, maybe salt, maybe oil, maybe a whisper, to ensure a good bake. You never turned your back on a cooling oven. You never cursed near it. And you definitely didn't let anyone walk counterclockwise around it. That's how you get cursed focaccia. And then there were the dreams. Romans placed serious stock in dream omens. If you dreamed of burnt bread, someone in your household was going to argue with a neighbor. If you dreamed of fresh, warm loaves, good news was coming, probably in the form of grain prices dropping, or a new delivery boy who didn't spill everything. You might even consult a dream interpreter or oniromancer before a big bake, especially if your dream involved smoke or spilled flour. One baker's diary, found in a villa in Kumai, includes a daily dream log and notes on how it affected that day's dough. The correlation? Completely unclear, but the commitment? Impressive. Quirky tidbit you probably didn't expect. Some bakers tied tiny bells to their dough hooks. Why? To scare away malevolent spirits that might flatten the bread. Others painted eyes on their flour jars to watch over the mixing process. If you've ever side-eyed a sourdough starter and whispered, "Be good," then congratulations, you're basically Roman. And of course, you never, ever baked on certain unlucky days, like the calends of March or after a major thunderstorm. Why? Because the gods were restless on those days and might interfere. Maybe your dough would collapse. Maybe your fire would misbehave. Maybe a ghost would eat your crust. You never knew, and you didn't want to find out. Even the water used for mixing had rules. Rainwater? Only after the second hour past sunrise. Well water? Filtered through linen blessed by a priestess, if you could afford it. Most of the time, you stuck with public fountains, which had their own baked-in risks. Once, a rumour spread that one fountain near the Aventine was cursed and made loaves go green overnight. The entire neighbourhood stopped using it for weeks. And then there were the chants. Some bakeries, especially family-run ones, sang while kneading. Not catchy songs, but rhythmic, low chants designed to sink the spirit of the dough. Think of it like a yoga class meets a bread fight. The idea was that harmony in the kneading would lead to harmony in the eating. Fewer family arguments, better digestion, more pleasant dreams. Even how you cooled your bread had ritual. You placed the loaves on woven mats in 3s or 5s, never 4s. Why? Because 4 was associated with death in some Mediterranean folk traditions. You also never stacked bread upside down. It was seen as an invitation to invite chaos into the house. And chaos, famously, doesn't go well with gluten. Now, were all these rituals effective? Who knows? But they offered something more powerful than proof. Routine. In a world where fires broke out often, armies could march through your street unannounced and emperors changed more often than public graffiti. You clung to the little superstitions. They made the bread feel safe. They made you feel safe. And it wasn't just about self-protection. Many bakers believed they were participating in something sacred. Each loaf was an offering, not just to the customer, but to the divine. You fed gods with bread. You marked births, marriages, and deaths with bread. You asked forgiveness with bread. You celebrated victories, real or imagined, with, you guessed it, more bread. Now, as you loop around back toward your bakery, you pass a neighbor's door. There's a fresh loaf hanging on it, wrapped in ivy and tied with twine. It's a warding charm, meant to keep away illness. The ivy's already wilting, but the bread looks perfect. Maybe it worked. You sigh, step inside, and begin prepping. Tomorrow's flour. The moon is high, the stars are shifting, and somewhere, just beyond the reach of logic, a tiny bell tied to your dough hook lets out a soft chime. Your hands are dusted with flour again before the sun even peeks over the rooftops. The stars are fading, and the ovens are warming. But today isn't just another cycle of dough and fire. It's inspection day. Not from the gods this time, but from Rome itself. And Rome, as you're well aware by now, is far less forgiving. You hear the clink of metal sandals outside, the soft murmurs of scribes, and the unmistakable creak of a wooden tablet being unrolled. It's not paranoia, it's the grain inspector, here to make sure your bakery isn't shortchanging the public or the empire. Let's back up for a second. In Rome, bread wasn't just food, it was policy. Bread was deeply entangled with the annona, the grain dole system that kept Rome's poorer citizens fed, and more importantly, quiet. If the bread stopped flowing, riots began, and emperors tended to prefer riots not happening during their breakfast. So yes, as a baker, you were part tradesperson, part public servant, part sacrificial offering on the altar of bureaucratic scrutiny. You had to meet the weight standards. You had to use the proper flour ratio. You had to follow pricing laws. If you cheated, well, best case, you were fined. Worst case, you were paraded through the streets in a chain and had your bakery sealed shut. One mainstream historical fact: Emperor Aurelian, in the 3rd century CE, introduced stricter regulations on bread distribution. He even issued detailed measurements for the loaves to ensure consistency. You can't just hand someone a fluffy, underweight loaf and hope they don't notice, not when their survival depends on it. And because this is Rome, they didn't just stop at measurements. No, they created charts, lists, penalties, officials with sticks. You've probably never been scared of a clipboard before, but one glance at the grain ledger in the hands of an imperial clerk and your palms start sweating, especially if yesterday's batch was running light. Historians still argue whether all these inspections were strictly enforced across the empire, or if some regions were a bit more flexible. Some evidence from Egypt and Gaul suggests local. Bakers had a lot more wiggle room than their Roman counterparts, though in the capital itself, being a little off-weight could be a very big problem. It wasn't just about fairness, it was about politics. Grain shortages could make or break emperors. Claudius, for example, faced a near revolt when grain ships were delayed. Nero blamed bakers for inflation, before promptly building his own grain warehouses. And during times of famine, bakers were often accused of hoarding or diluting flour. Whether they were actually guilty didn't matter much once an angry mob started forming. So, bakers developed countermeasures. Some bribed inspectors, small coins tucked into a sack of barley, or a sweet cake slipped into the satchel. Others joined baker guilds to strengthen their collective voice. You might be in one now, standing shoulder to shoulder with fellow flour flingers, practicing how to look both apologetic and innocent. One quirky tidbit: some bakeries posted mock poetry or slogans on their walls to distract inspectors Like literally paint, a well-fed man is a quiet man next to the ovens. A little propaganda to keep the mood light and the clipboard from opening. Whether it worked? Let's just say the empire never lacked for graffiti artists. You step out to greet the inspector. His eyes go straight to your scales, then your loaf rack, then your soot pile. He says nothing, scribbles something, then moves to your cooling table. You know better than to speak. The last baker who cracked a joke during inspection had his rolling pin snapped in half, symbolically, but still traumatic. While he checks your loaves, your mind drifts. You remember stories of the worst-case punishments, being tossed into your own oven. Was that real? Historians still argue whether any bakers were literally baked as punishment. Some think it's urban myth, spread by dramatic poets. Others point to suspiciously specific warnings carved near older bakeries. And if you weren't executed, you could still be blacklisted. Your name carved into a tablet, displayed in the marketplace. So-and-so cheats the weight. Try selling anything after that. You'd be lucky to sell ashes. That's why some bakers went overboard in the other direction. Overweight loaves, double portions, secret gifts hidden inside, like a fig or a coin or a carved token of fortuna. Not because they were generous, but because they were terrified. You could make people forget bad bread, but not if they had to report it. Rome also had a few elite bakers who served directly under the Praefectus Annonae, the grain overseer. These lucky or unlucky souls baked the ceremonial loaves for festivals or the emperor's household. Great honor, of course. Great pressure, too. If your bread split weirdly down the middle, someone might think it was an omen, and nobody wants to be the baker who accidentally predicts civil war. You glance back at your oven. A light crack has formed in one of your loaves. Not huge, but it's there. You hope the inspector sees a golden crust, not a sign of divine disapproval. He finally nods, scratches his ear, and says, "Acceptable." You exhale. He stamps a wax, seal on your ledger, and walks off. You're safe, for now. But you know he'll be back next week, or tomorrow, or worse, unannounced, like a gluten-powered ghost. So you pull out your scales again. You check your logs. You wipe your bench down with sacred ash and a damp rag. Because every day is another chance to be caught, or another chance to survive. It's exhausting, isn't it? Baking under the thumb of empire. You'd think flour was just flour, but in Rome, it's a matter of civic stability, social control, and political theatre. Even now, as the smell of crust and rosemary fills your nose, your brain is still cataloguing every possible infraction. Did the loaves cool too close together? Did you miss that chanted rhyme over the grain bin? Is Saturn still in retrograde? You shake it off and reach for your next batch of dough. The city will need more bread tomorrow. And if you don't make it, someone else will. The morning rush fades, but you're still on your feet. There's dough drying under your fingernails. Your tunic smells like toasted grain, and your legs feel like marble columns. Tall, aching, and a little crumbly at the joints. But the day's not over yet. Because now comes the weird part of your job. You're not just a baker in Rome. You're a part-time religious liaison, occasional public entertainer, and full-blown ritual technician. Because bread, believe it or not, shows up everywhere in Roman life. Weddings, funerals, court trials, and, wait for it, magical curses. Let's start light. You've probably already made a few wedding loaves. Soft, braided, brushed with honey and sesame. They're ceremonial offerings, handed out to guests as part of the celebration. One mainstream historical fact: Roman brides often touched a symbolic loaf of bread before entering their new home, as a way of sealing their domestic role. Sweet, right? Kind of. Until you realize it also implied she'd now be expected to bake every day. Now funerals, that's a different oven entirely. Funeral loaves were often coarse and dense, made with darker flour, or even sprinkled with charcoal. Symbolism mattered. You'd bake them round, representing the cycle of life, and they'd be placed on altars alongside coins, wine, and sometimes tiny statues. If the deceased had been a baker, guess what? The statues were mini ovens, sometimes full bakeries in terracotta with tiny clay loaves. Because of course they were. Quirky tidbit incoming. Some Roman tombs feature what historians call bread epigrams, poems praising not the deceased's virtue or wisdom, but their baking skills. You'd read things like, "He made the crispiest crust in Trastevere," or "No one shaped a better panis quadratus." Not even kidding. A baker's legacy might literally be the shape of his loaf. But it gets stranger. Some of your customers aren't looking for food or ritual. They want tools for magic. You hear the door creak. In walks a young woman wearing a silver charm and the look of someone who's about to ask for something mildly illegal. She leans close and whispers, "I need a love loaf." Ah, that old chestnut. Love loaves were part of Roman folk magic. You'd bake a small sweet bun, maybe with dates, maybe with crushed poppy, and secretly inscribe the target's name into it. Then the client would feed it to their unsuspecting crush, hoping to spark affection, or at the very least, gastrointestinal vulnerability. Did it work? Historians still argue whether love loaves were a genuine practice or mostly fiction spun by later authors. But even if they were mostly symbolic, you can bet bakers got roped into it. Of course, not all magical baking was so, well, lovey-dovey. Some wanted loaves for cursing. You remember that one older man who came in muttering about a neighbor stealing his cart. He asked you for a loaf baked in the shape of a donkey's rear end. You didn't ask questions. You just shaped the dough, baked it until it was hard as marble, and handed it over. Later you heard he buried it in a garden with a lead curse tablet inside. Magical baking wasn't mainstream, but it wasn't rare either. The overlap between food, ritual, and belief was porous. In fact, some temples had their own bakers, not just for feeding priests, but for preparing sacred cakes. These weren't your everyday loaves. They had to be pure, unblemished, baked according to celestial charts and precise timings. One cake for Vesta might require barley ground under moonlight. Another for Ceres might have to cool facing east. And if a mouse so much as looked at it the wrong way, burn the whole batch and start again. You, being just a neighborhood baker, only occasionally get those special orders. But when they come in, you treat them like gold. Not just for the extra coin, but because being associated with sacred loaves boosts your reputation. People gossip. "Oh, he baked for the Temple of Bonadea." Suddenly, your everyday bread tastes holier. You sell out faster. Simple economics. But there's a downside too. Ritual orders bring ritual risks. You remember one spring festival when you accidentally used the wrong flour, millet instead of emmer wheat, for the festival of Tellus, goddess of the earth. You thought no one would notice, until the priest sniffed the loaf and fainted. Whether from offense or allergies, you'll never know. The next day, someone smeared goat's blood on your shop door. Was it a prank? A curse? A raccoon with a flair for drama? Hard to say. But you started double-checking your flour bins after. That another time, a minor senator's wife asked for 12 miniature crescent loaves, each to be blessed with a different incantation and burned at midnight. You followed the instructions exactly, down to the spiral pattern etched into the crusts. The next week, her husband was publicly arrested for bribery. Coincidence? Maybe. But you still find pieces of crescent crust in your oven grate when the wind blows weird. Even ordinary loaves had layers of meaning. The way the crust split could be read as an omen. A perfectly round loaf. Good harvest ahead. A loaf that burned at the base but not the top. Someone nearby has impure thoughts. Honestly, at this point, you're more worried about loaf psychology than baking time. And yet, despite all the superstition and social pressure, you love it. There's something sacred about shaping dough with your hands, watching it rise, listening to the faint hiss as it hits hot stone. You're not just making food, you're shaping symbols, tokens, talismans. People walk into your shop with problems, hunger, hope, grief, lust. You hand them a loaf, and somehow they leave a little lighter. Even if it's just carbs and habit, there's magic in that. And at night, when the city quiets and the coals fade to red, you sometimes whisper a little prayer to Fornax. Not because you think she'll answer, but because it feels like someone should be thanked. For heat, for timing, for not burning the bottom of the last batch. Rome might see your job as a civic duty. Your neighbors might see it as a necessity. But to you, it's something more. It's flour and fire, sacred and silly, heavy and light, and tomorrow it starts all over again. By now, you know every creak in the bakery's beams, the way the rafters groan when the sun hits them just right, the way the door sighs inward when the evening breeze slips down the alley. You've baked your 100th loaf today, maybe your 1000th. It doesn't matter. They blur together, golden, warm, and gone. But this last bit of the day, is yours. You move slower now. Your hands still work, out of muscle memory more than will. You wipe down the counter with a damp cloth that smells faintly of olive oil and charcoal. You sweep up a little flour from the corner, watching it puff like lazy smoke. The oven's heat radiates faintly, no longer aggressive, just present, like the heartbeat of the space. Outside, Rome cools. The rattle of chariot wheels fades into the distance. Laughter spills from a nearby wine shop, muffled by thick stone walls. Somewhere, someone's dog barks at absolutely nothing, as dogs have done since time began. You stretch your back and wonder, not for the first time, how long your knees are going to last, and yet something compels you to stay, to linger in the stillness of this flower-dusted temple. Because this city of yours, this behemoth of marble, politics, and public fountains, doesn't sleep easily. And someone, somewhere, will always need bread at dawn. Let's rewind for a moment. Remember when you started this job? You barely knew your way around a peel, let alone how to read the mood of a crust. Your first loaves were too dense, your second batch too pale. A local kid once bit into your bread and said it tasted like sandals. You pretended to laugh. It hurt, but you got better. You listened, watched, practiced. You learned to recognize when the dough was kneaded just enough by the slight hiss it made when you pressed a finger in. You could tell if your oven was ready not by temperature, but by scent. If the bricks smelled slightly like hazelnuts, it was go time. That's the kind of knowledge no one teaches. It settles in your bones like flour in a fingerprint. And as your skills grew, so did the layers of what you were part of. Bread was never just bread in Rome. It was law, religion, economy, gossip, survival. It showed up at political riots and temple sacrifices, on wedding tables and funeral altars. It was taxed, regulated, celebrated, and cursed. You, dear baker, have stood at the crossroads of all these things. Mainstream historical fact: the Roman grain supply was one of the most complex logistical feats of the ancient world. Grain ships crossed the Mediterranean, sailing from Egypt to Ostia, then carted to Rome's granaries before arriving at your humble doorstep. Your loaves were the final step in a vast, invisible empire of grain, a machine of labour, harvest, transport, and politics, ending in a crusted round loaf on a wooden shelf. That's power, quiet, yeasty power, and yet, sometimes, you feel small, insignificant. Just a guy with an apron and aching arms. Especially when things go wrong. Like when the flour delivery runs late and the line outside grows long and irritated. Or when a rat chews through your sack of poppy seed. Or when some noble's spoiled son storms in demanding honey loaves because his pet monkey refuses to eat coarse grain. That happened once. He tipped you with a gold ring. You still don't know if it was stolen. And sometimes, more seriously, there are whispers of unrest, of grain shortages, of riots in the Subura. You listen, but keep kneading. What else can you do? The weight of empire is heavy, but bread rises anyway. There's a fringe tidbit you heard once, could be myth, could be true, that Nero, yes, that Nero, once disguised himself and wandered into a bakery at dawn to taste the people's bread. Supposedly, he burned his mouth, cursed the baker, and left without paying. But the baker, he framed the crust Nero bit and hung it on his wall. Historians still argue whether the story has any truth to it. But either way, it captures something real. Bakers were everywhere, quiet witnesses to power, to poverty, to love and loss. People rarely noticed you, until the bread was gone. So now, as you sit on your stool near the dying oven, you reflect. You think of the girl who once left a fig in thanks for a free loaf, the priest who offered to bless your kneading bench, the rival baker who finally admitted your crust had better snap. It's not glory, it's not wealth, but it's something. You close your eyes for a moment and breathe deeply. Warm stone, yeast, smoke, ash. There's a peace in it, a rhythm, a truth. And tomorrow, you'll do it all again. The wind down begins here. Let it stretch long and soft, like the final exhale of a long day. The fire's almost out. The coals wink like fading stars, and shadows creep back into the corners of your shop. The tools are cleaned, the shelves are bare, and silence nestles gently across the stone floor. You run your fingers along the edge of the wooden table, smooth from years, of wear. It's quiet now. The kind of quiet that settles behind your ribs, unspooling your thoughts like thread. Even the city, bustling beast that it is, seems to slow. In this stillness, you remember why you do it. Not for coin, not for praise, but for that moment, just before dawn, when the first loaf cracks in the heat, and you know the day has begun. So you rise, stretch once more, and douse the last flicker of fire. You step into the cool night, lock the door, and walk down the alley, trailing flour like breadcrumbs. Somewhere behind you, the oven cools. Somewhere ahead, another sunrise waits. But for now, you rest. Thanks for guiding this all the way through. What a sleepy, flower-dusted odyssey we've had. If you'd like a version with gentle ambient background cues, visuals for animation, or an MP3 style voiceover draft, just say the word. Until next time, may your loaves be golden, your gods minor, and your dreams Roman. Sleep well, baker.